U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham, a longtime Republican lawmaker from South Carolina and a close ally of President Trump, has died at the age of 71.
When reports surfaced about what the FBI allegedly uncovered inside Lindsey Graham's mansion, speculation spread almost instantly. But the deeper investigators and critics looked, the more the conversation shifted away from the property itself and toward the man who had spent decades shaping American politics. Behind the image of a respected conservative senator stood a career filled with surprising reversals, unanswered questions, and controversies that never fully disappeared. And that may have been the biggest mystery of all. The senator America thought it knew. Long before his name became tied to unanswered questions and growing controversy, Lindsey Graham had established himself as one of the most recognizable faces in American politics. To millions of viewers, he projected confidence, experience, and unwavering convictions. Whenever an international crisis dominated the headlines, there was a good chance Graham would be among the first senators interviewed, offering his perspective on military strategy, foreign affairs, or national security. Over time, that familiar presence helped shape the image many Americans came to accept without much hesitation. His rise in Washington was anything but accidental. After serving as a lawyer in South Carolina, Graham won a seat in the House of Representatives in 1995, where he quickly gained national attention during the impeachment proceedings of the late 1990s. 7 years later, in 2002, he successfully ran for the United States Senate, taking over the seat vacated by longtime Senator Strom Thurmond. It was a position that carried enormous expectations.
A longtime member of Congress, first elected to the House of Representatives in 1992, he has served as South Carolina's senator since 2003.
But Graham steadily expanded his influence and became one of the Republican Party's most recognizable figures. As the years passed, his reputation only continued to grow. He earned a place on the Senate Judiciary Committee, helping shape the confirmation of federal judges, while later serving as chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. Beyond Capitol Hill, he became known for traveling extensively to conflict zones and meeting with foreign leaders, reinforcing his image as a lawmaker deeply invested in America's role on the world stage. One of the strongest symbols of Lindsey Graham's reputation was the Three Amigos alliance with John McCain and Joe Lieberman. Their frequent appearances and shared support for active American leadership abroad helped define Graham's image as a steadfast advocate for national security. Remaining politically relevant across multiple administrations is no easy feat. Yet, Graham managed to do exactly that. Through changing presidents, shifting party dynamics, and some of the country's most divisive political battles, he consistently stayed near the center of the conversation. Admirers saw resilience and experience. Critics saw someone remarkably skilled at adapting whenever the political landscape changed. Either way, one thing was undeniable. Lindsey Graham had spent decades building a carefully crafted public image that appeared remarkably consistent from the outside. But as time went on, many people began asking a different question. How much of that image reflected the real man, and how much remained hidden behind closed doors? The private life hidden behind politics. For someone who spent decades in the national spotlight, Lindsey Graham revealed surprisingly little about the life he lived away from cameras. While his voting record, speeches, and policy positions were constantly dissected, one part of his story remained almost untouched. It wasn't because people weren't interested. It was because Graham rarely gave them anything to examine. That silence became impossible to ignore. Throughout his political career, Graham often spoke about traditional values and emphasized the importance of strong families. He opposed same-sex marriage and regularly described the nuclear family as a cornerstone of American society. Yet, despite making those issues part of his public platform, his own personal life looked very different. He never married, never had children, and consistently avoided discussing his relationships in interviews or public appearances. The lack of answers created an opening that speculation quickly filled. Over the years, tabloids, online forums, and social media users repeatedly circulated rumors about Graham's private life, including claims regarding his sexuality. None of those allegations were ever substantiated, and Graham never confirmed them. Instead, he continued keeping his personal life firmly outside the public conversation, refusing to let rumors dictate his public image. Still, there was another side to his family story that received far less attention. According to his official campaign biography, Graham experienced devastating loss at a young age after both of his parents died while he was still in college. Rather than stepping away from responsibility, he stepped into it. He took legal custody of his younger sister and eventually adopted her, ensuring she had a stable home and someone to depend on during an incredibly difficult time. It was a deeply personal act that revealed a level of commitment and sacrifice many Americans never associated with his political persona.
Darlene was close to her brother, having been raised by him after the death of both of their parents when she was a young teen.
That reality made the public picture even more complicated. On one hand stood a senator who passionately defended traditional family values while never creating a conventional family of his own. On the other stood a man who quietly dedicated himself to raising his sister with little public recognition. Those two realities didn't necessarily contradict each other, but together they created questions that neither supporters nor critics could easily answer. In politics, unanswered questions rarely stay unanswered forever. When public figures choose not to explain certain parts of their lives, others often attempt to fill in the blanks themselves. Graham generally responded to personal inquiries with brief, carefully measured remarks before steering conversations back to policy, a pattern that only fueled continued curiosity over the years. Eventually, the focus expanded beyond his private life. People began revisiting his speeches, his decisions, and the image he had spent decades building. And before long, an unexpected place would bring all of those lingering questions back into the spotlight once again. Why one mansion changed the conversation. By the time reports began circulating about what was allegedly discovered inside Lindsey Graham's mansion, the public debate had already moved far beyond the walls of a single home. The property may have captured headlines, but for many people, it simply became the latest reason to revisit a long list of unanswered questions that had followed the senator for years. The mansion itself wasn't what transformed public opinion. It was what it represented. For decades, Graham had carefully separated his public responsibilities from his private life, revealing only what he chose to share. That approach had largely worked throughout his career, but once renewed attention focused on his personal world, many observers started looking back through everything they thought they knew about him. Instead of searching for one dramatic revelation, they began comparing the image he projected with the record he had built over nearly 3 decades in Washington. His speeches were revisited. His interviews took on new meaning. Long-forgotten political decisions resurfaced, and past controversies found a new audience. Supporters argued that Graham had simply been one of the Senate's most experienced lawmakers, while critics believed the renewed scrutiny exposed inconsistencies that had always been there but had escaped broader attention. The conversation gradually shifted away from the mansion itself. Instead, people asked a much broader question. Had the public ever truly known the real Lindsey Graham? That question proved far more difficult to answer than any rumor connected to a property. There was no single event that explained the growing skepticism surrounding him. No hidden document suddenly solved every mystery. What emerged instead was something far less dramatic, but arguably more compelling. A series of contradictions that stretched across his political career, personal life, and public image. The deeper people looked, the more those contradictions seemed connected. His carefully cultivated reputation as a traditional conservative was now being weighed against years of unanswered questions about his private life. His image as a dependable statesman was increasingly measured against decisions that left both supporters and critics divided. Individually, those issues might have seemed insignificant. Together, they painted a far more complicated portrait than the one most Americans had seen on television. Whether those contradictions reflected political strategy, personal privacy, or simple public misunderstanding depended largely on who was doing the judging. But one thing had become impossible to ignore. The conversation was no longer centered on a house. It had become a broader examination of the man behind the headlines. And as that examination continued, attention shifted from his private life to something even harder to dismiss. A growing list of political contradictions that had been quietly building for years, waiting for the moment when people finally started connecting the dots. When his public image started falling apart. The questions surrounding Lindsey Graham didn't emerge overnight. They built gradually. fueled less by one dramatic controversy than by a growing perception that his priorities no longer matched those of the people who sent him to Washington. For much of his career, Graham was regarded as one of the Senate's leading voices on foreign policy. He appeared regularly on national television to discuss military conflicts, international alliances, and global security. His frequent overseas travel reinforced that reputation, earning praise from those who believed America needed a strong presence abroad. Back home, however, some South Carolinians began asking a different question. While Graham devoted significant attention to international affairs, many constituents wanted to hear more about the issues affecting their daily lives. Rising living costs, local economic challenges, and support for small businesses increasingly dominated conversations across the state. Critics argued that Graham often seemed more comfortable discussing events unfolding thousands of miles away than addressing the financial pressures facing families in South Carolina. Local newspapers and editorial boards occasionally echoed those concerns, pointing out the contrast between his constant appearances on national news programs and the relatively limited attention given to state-specific issues. It wasn't that Graham ignored South Carolina altogether. Rather, many voters believed the balance had shifted too far toward global affairs at the expense of problems closer to home. That perception followed him throughout the later years of his career. Only days before his death, Graham had returned from another visit to Kyiv, where he met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. According to Zelensky, it was approximately Graham's 10th wartime visit to Ukraine, highlighting just how personally invested he had become in the conflict.
What I think? Complete, utter disaster. I've been to Ukraine 8 or 9 times since the war started. I talked to Zelensky this morning. Don't take the bait.
Supporters viewed those trips as evidence of his commitment to defending Democratic allies. Others questioned whether that same level of attention should have been directed toward the people he represented in South Carolina. On their own, these criticisms might not have dramatically altered Graham's public image. Politicians are frequently accused of focusing on the wrong issues, and disagreements over priorities are hardly unusual in Washington. But combined with the ongoing curiosity surrounding his private life, the picture became increasingly difficult to ignore. A senator who championed traditional family values while guarding his own personal life. A lawmaker elected to represent South Carolina, who was often better known for his involvement overseas than for local issues. Individually, each contradiction could be explained. Together, they caused more people to wonder whether the public image Graham had spent decades cultivating told the entire story. And if those questions were beginning to reshape how Americans viewed him, an even more dramatic transformation was still ahead, because the political reversal that followed would leave allies, opponents, and longtime observers asking how one of the Republican Party's fiercest critics became one of its strongest loyalists. From Trump's fiercest critic to loyal ally. If there was one chapter of Lindsey Graham's career that left both supporters and critics stunned, it was the remarkable shift in his relationship with Donald Trump. Few political transformations in recent Republican history were as closely scrutinized, largely because Graham's own words from earlier years stood in such sharp contrast to what came later. During the 2016 Republican presidential primary, Graham made little effort to hide his opposition to Trump. He repeatedly warned that putting Trump at the top of the Republican ticket would damage both the party and the country, delivering some of the strongest criticism heard from within Republican ranks. At the time, Graham positioned himself as one of the party's most outspoken skeptics, and many conservatives who opposed Trump's rise viewed him as a rare voice willing to challenge the direction the party appeared to be taking. But politics has a way of changing alliances. As the years passed, Graham's relationship with Trump underwent a dramatic transformation. The fierce public criticism gradually gave way to visible cooperation, frequent appearances together, and a close political partnership. They were seen playing golf, speaking positively about one another, and standing side by side during some of the most contentious moments of Trump's presidency. Whenever major political controversies erupted, Graham often emerged as one of Trump's most vocal defenders on television and in the Senate. The contrast was impossible to miss. Many longtime political observers revisited Graham's earlier statements, comparing them with his later comments supporting the very man he had once warned Republicans against embracing. The reversal became one of the defining moments of his public career, raising questions that followed him for years. Supporters offered one explanation. They argued that Graham recognized the changing political reality within the Republican Party and chose to work alongside its most influential figure rather than isolate himself. From that perspective, the shift reflected pragmatism rather than hypocrisy. They believed he adapted to new circumstances in order to remain effective and continue advancing conservative priorities. Critics saw something entirely different. To them, the transformation suggested that political survival had become more important than consistency. They argued that Graham's willingness to abandon his earlier criticisms demonstrated how flexible his public positions could become when power and influence were at stake. Whether fair or not, that perception strengthened the broader narrative that many of his convictions seemed to evolve alongside the political landscape. That lingering debate extended well beyond his relationship with Trump. It became part of a larger question surrounding Graham's entire career. Were his changing positions evidence of practical leadership in an unpredictable political environment, or did they reveal a politician willing to adjust his principles whenever circumstances demanded it? No single answer ever satisfied everyone. Yet, the dramatic reversal ensured that Graham's reputation would never again be viewed through the same lens. And as debates over his political transformation continued, an even longer list of controversies was quietly taking shape. Ethics concerns, legal scrutiny, and inflammatory public remarks would soon add new chapters to a legacy that was becoming increasingly difficult to define. The controversies that defined his final years. By the closing years of Lindsey Graham's political career, the questions surrounding him had grown far beyond speculation about his private life or shifting political alliances. A series of controversies placed his actions under even greater scrutiny, leaving supporters and critics with sharply different views of the legacy he would ultimately leave behind. One of the most notable moments came when the Senate Ethics Committee issued Graham a formal letter of admonition after determining that he had solicited campaign donations from inside a federal building. The rule exists to keep official government business separate from political fundraising, and while the reprimand stopped short of more severe punishment, it nevertheless became part of his public record. For many politicians, such a finding can overshadow years of public service. In Graham's case, however, it was quickly eclipsed by the next wave of political headlines. Attention also focused on efforts to challenge the 2020 election results. A Georgia special grand jury recommended Lindsey Graham for prosecutorial consideration over post-election calls to state officials.
Senator Lindsey Graham. Today we learned a special grand jury in Georgia recommended charges against him relating to attempts to overturn the election results in 2020 in that state.
Graham insisted the conversations were part of his Senate duties. He was never charged, but the recommendation fueled ongoing political debate. Then came one of the most controversial remarks of his career. As tensions between Russia and Ukraine escalated, Graham publicly suggested that someone in Russia should remove President Vladimir Putin from power. The statement immediately sparked international criticism, with many foreign policy experts warning that language from a sitting U.S. senator carried consequences far beyond domestic politics. Some lawmakers, including fellow Republicans, distanced themselves from the comment, arguing that such rhetoric could further inflame an already dangerous international conflict. Back home, Graham also faced growing political resistance from within his own party. During a Trump rally in South Carolina, he was openly booed by members of the Republican crowd, a striking moment for a senator who had represented the state for decades. Around the same time, he faced a competitive primary challenge from Paul Dans, who criticized Graham as an establishment figure increasingly disconnected from conservative voters. Although Graham ultimately secured the Republican nomination for another Senate campaign, the dissatisfaction fueling that challenge did not disappear. Despite growing criticism, Lindsey Graham maintained close friendships across party lines. Senator Dick Durbin praised him as honest and dependable, saying Graham could fiercely disagree in public while remaining respectful in private, revealing a side many never saw beyond political headlines. That contrast became the defining theme of Graham's career. He was a senator praised for his expertise on national security, yet criticized for appearing more invested in global affairs than local concerns. A politician who championed traditional family values while fiercely protecting his own private life. A Republican who once condemned Donald Trump before becoming one of his closest allies. A public figure whose record included ethics scrutiny, election-related controversy, and comments that drew international backlash, while still earning respect from political opponents who knew him personally. Perhaps that is why Lindsey Graham continues to inspire such divided opinions. Every chapter of his career seems to reveal a different version of the same man, making it difficult to determine which one truly reflected who he was. And maybe that was the greatest mystery all along. Was the real Lindsey Graham the figure America watched from the Senate floor, the intensely private man who guarded his personal life, or someone the public never fully got the chance to know before the story came to an end? What do you think Lindsey Graham's true legacy will be? Was he a principled leader, a skilled political survivor, or something in between? Share your thoughts below, and watch our next investigation for another untold story.